Snoop Dogg, the legendary rapper, cruised through his upscale neighborhood in his luxury car. The city lights reflected off the sleek black paint as he leaned back in his seat, one hand on the wheel, the other tapping along to the smooth beat playing from his speakers. It had been a long day, meetings, studio sessions, and the usual hustle of his career. But now, in the cool evening air, he finally had a moment to himself. As he drove past quiet streets lined with palm trees, he took a deep breath, letting the calm wash over him. This neighborhood was his escape from the noise of the world, a place where he could unwind without distractions. He thought about how far he had come, from the rough streets of Long Beach to global fame, wealth, and influence. The engine purred softly as he turned a corner, streetlights casting long shadows on the road ahead. Everything felt still, peaceful, until flashing red and blue lights appeared in his rearview mirror. His grip on the steering wheel tightened. A routine drive was about to turn into something far more serious. Snoop Dogg's peaceful drive was suddenly interrupted by the flashing red and blue lights in his rearview mirror. His heart sank, but he remained calm. He wasn't speeding, hadn't run a red light, and had done nothing wrong. Still, he knew how these situations could go. With a sigh, he slowed down and pulled over to the side of the road, the police car stopping right behind him. The officer approached with heavy steps, flashlight in one hand, the other resting near her holstered gun. Snoop kept his hands on the steering wheel, watching through the mirror as she reached his window. "License and registration," she demanded, her voice sharp and cold. Snoop raised an eyebrow. "Evening, officer." "What seems to be the problem?" he asked, keeping his voice calm and collected. She didn't answer, just held out her hand, waiting. He reached into the glove compartment, moving slowly, making sure she could see every motion. He knew how quickly things could escalate if an officer thought he was reaching for the wrong thing. He handed over the documents, but she barely glanced at them before shifting her gaze back to him. Her eyes narrowed as she studied his face. "Step out of the vehicle," she ordered. Snoop frowned. "For what?" "Step out of the car, now." Her tone was harsher this time, her grip on the gun tightening slightly. Snoop sighed, shaking his head slightly. He had been in situations like this before. He knew his rights, and he knew he had done nothing wrong. But arguing on the spot wouldn't help. With slow, deliberate movements, he unbuckled his seatbelt and opened the door. As he stepped out, he kept his hands visible. The officer's eyes scanned him, her suspicion clear. "Turn around and put your hands on the hood," she instructed. Snoop stood still, looking her in the eye. "I'd like to know why I'm being treated like a suspect," he said, his voice steady but firm. "We got reports of stolen vehicles in the area," she replied without hesitation. "Your car matches the description." Snoop let out a short laugh, though there was no humor in it. "This car is mine. Bought and paid for." The officer didn't respond. Instead, she moved closer, the tension thick in the air. The street was quiet, but Snoop could feel the presence of eyes watching from behind curtains and windows. People always watched when things like this happened. Snoop inhaled deeply, keeping his emotions in check. He knew how easily situations like this could spiral out of control. He had seen it happen too many times. "If you run the plates, you'll see everything checks out," he said, keeping his voice measured. The officer didn't move, as if she was debating her next step. This wasn't just a traffic stop, it was something more. And Snoop knew he had to be careful with what came next. Snoop Dogg stood by his car, his hands resting on the hood as the officer eyed him suspiciously. He had been in situations like this before, but it never got easier. He took a deep breath, keeping his cool. "Officer," he said, his voice steady, "I'd like to know why I'm being searched." "What exactly did I do?" Officer Drexler folded her arms, her expression cold. Your vehicle matches the description of a stolen car reported in this area, she said. Snoop let out a slow breath. The excuse was old, too familiar. A successful black man in a nice car? That was all the reason some officers needed. This is my car, he said, glancing back at the sleek vehicle behind him. I have the registration. You've already seen it. That doesn't mean anything, Drexler shot back. I need to be sure. She stepped closer. Turn around. Hands behind your back. I'm patting you down. Snoop clenched his jaw. He wasn't carrying anything illegal. He wasn't a criminal. But she wasn't listening, she had already made up her mind about him. This isn't necessary, he said, shaking his head. You can call in my plates, check the system. Everything will match. Turn around, she repeated, her voice firm. Her hand rested on her holstered gun, a silent warning. Snoop exhaled, knowing he had no choice. Pushing back would only make things worse. He slowly turned, placing his hands behind his back. As she ran her hands roughly over his arms and torso, Snoop looked around. The neighborhood was no longer quiet. Curtains were shifting, shadows moving behind windows. People were watching. A few neighbors stood on their porches, pretending not to stare. A woman across the street held her phone up. Was she recording? Maybe. Maybe not. The humiliation settled deep in Snoop's chest. He had spent years building his career, his reputation. He had helped his community, given back, and mentored young artists. But right now, none of that mattered. To this officer, he was just another suspect. She finished patting him down, stepping back. Where are you headed tonight? She asked. Home, Snoop replied simply. The officer narrowed her eyes. That right? She looked around as if expecting someone to confirm his answer. This is my neighborhood, Snoop said, glancing at his house just down the street. I've lived here for years. Drexler didn't respond. Instead, she grabbed her radio. Dispatch, I need a check on plates, she said, reading off his license number. The silence stretched. Snoop stood still, waiting. A few neighbors whispered to each other, shaking their heads. He could feel the weight of their stares. Some looked concerned. Others, curious. He knew what they were thinking. How could this be happening to Snoop Dogg? But it was. And he knew it wouldn't stop here. Snoop Dogg stood tall, his arms crossed as he stared at Officer Drexler. He had been through situations like this before, but tonight, he wasn't going to just let it slide. Officer, he said, his voice calm but firm, I know my rights. I've given you my license, my registration, and I've told you I live here. Now, I need you to call your superior before we go any further. Drexler narrowed her eyes. There's no need for that, she snapped. I'm handling this. Snoop let out a slow breath. He knew that tone, it was the sound of someone who wasn't used to being challenged. But he wasn't about to back down. Nah, he said, shaking his head. You're not just gonna handle this. Not tonight. Call your superior. For a moment, she didn't move. The tension in the air thickened. The flashing lights from the police cruiser still bathed the street in red and blue, making everything feel surreal. Neighbors were watching, some peeking through blinds, others standing on their porches. Snoop could feel their eyes on him. He knew some of them were probably shocked. This wasn't supposed to happen to someone like him. He wasn't just another black man driving a nice car, he was Snoop Dogg. A legend. A businessman. A cultural icon. And yet, here he was. Officer Drexler hesitated, but finally, she grabbed her radio. Dispatch, I need a supervisor at my location, she said through gritted teeth. Snoop smirked slightly. That's more like it, he muttered under his breath. Now, all he had to do was wait. He leaned against his car, arms still crossed, watching Drexler closely. She avoided his gaze, her jaw tight with frustration. She knew she had messed up, but she wasn't about to admit it. Not yet. The silence between them was heavy. The only sound was the crackling of the radio and the distant hum of traffic. Snoop didn't say another word. He had already made his move. Now, it was her turn to figure out how to fix this mess. A few minutes passed, but it felt longer. The entire street felt like it was holding its breath. Then, the sound of another police cruiser approaching cut through the night air. Snoop straightened up as the car pulled in behind Drexler's. A tall, older officer stepped out, Captain Rivera. As soon as he saw Snoop, his face changed. He recognized him immediately. "Snoop?" Rivera said, walking up quickly. He looked from Snoop to Drexler, then back again. "What's going on here?" Snoop didn't answer. He didn't have to. He just raised an eyebrow, waiting for them to explain. Tonight, he wasn't playing their game. Tonight, they were going to answer to him. Captain Rivera stepped out of his cruiser, his sharp eyes scanning the scene. The moment he saw Snoop Dogg standing beside his car, arms crossed, he knew something wasn't right. He walked up quickly, glancing at Officer Drexler, who stood stiffly beside him. "Snoop?" Rivera said, his tone filled with surprise. "What's going on here?" Snoop didn't move. He just gave a small nod and waited. He wanted to hear it from them. Drexler hesitated before speaking. "Sir, I pulled him over because his vehicle matched the description of a stolen car." Rivera frowned and turned back to Snoop. "That true?" Snoop let out a small chuckle, shaking his head. "You tell me, Captain. You really think my car is stolen? You think I'd be cruising around my own neighborhood in a stolen car?" Rivera sighed. He already knew this was bad. He turned to Drexler, his expression hardening. "Did you run the plates?" Drexler swallowed. "Not yet, sir." Rivera's jaw tightened. "Not yet?" His voice was sharp. "You pulled over a man, this man, without running the plates first?" Drexler said nothing. The weight of her mistake was sinking in. Rivera exhaled sharply and shook his head. "This is unacceptable." He turned back to Snoop, his face filled with regret. "I'm sorry, man. This shouldn't have happened." Snoop nodded, still calm. He had expected this. It was always the same story. First, the accusation. Then, when the truth came out, the apologies. But he wasn't going to let it end there. He turned back to Drexler, looking her straight in the eye. "Tell me something, officer," he said, his voice smooth but firm. "What exactly made you think I didn't belong here?" Drexler opened her mouth, but no words came out. Was it his car? His clothes? His face? She had no answer, at least, not one she could say out loud. Snoop tilted his head, waiting. But the silence stretched on. The officer shifted uncomfortably, her hands twitching at her sides. She knew the truth, but saying it would only make things worse for her. That silence was louder than any excuse she could have given. Rivera turned to Drexler. "You're dismissed. I'll handle this." Drexler hesitated, then nodded stiffly and walked back to her cruiser. Rivera faced Snoop again. "This shouldn't have happened," he repeated. "I'll make sure this is handled." Snoop studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Good," he said simply. "Because I'm not letting this slide." With that, he stepped back into his car, his message clear: this wasn't just about one bad cop. This was about a system that needed to change. And Snoop was about to make sure everyone knew it. Snoop Dogg sat in his car for a moment, gripping the steering wheel. The situation had ended, but the frustration still burned inside him. He had been racially profiled in his own neighborhood, treated like a criminal for no reason. An apology from Captain Rivera wasn't enough. He knew this wasn't just about him, this was about something bigger. He pulled out his phone, opened the camera, and hit record. "Yo, what's up, y'all?" he said, his voice calm but serious. "Tonight, I got pulled over for driving while black. No crime, no reason, just suspicion. The officer didn't even check my plates before treating me like a suspect. This happens every day to black men and women across the country, and I'm tired of it. We gotta talk about this." He uploaded the video with the caption, "Enough is enough. #justice." Within hours, the video exploded. Social media lit up with outrage. Celebrities, activists, and everyday people shared their own experiences with racial profiling. News outlets picked up the story, and soon, the whole country was talking about it. Snoop wasn't done. He called his team, his lawyers, and some civil rights activists he had worked with before. They needed a plan. "We need accountability," he said during a meeting. "This ain't about one cop making a mistake. This is about a broken system that lets this happen over and over again." His team got to work. They contacted city officials, police reform advocates, and the media. A press conference was set up. If the police department thought this would just blow over, they were wrong. 2 days later, Snoop stood in front of a crowd of reporters and supporters. Cameras flashed as he stepped up to the microphone. "This isn't just about me," he began. "This is about every black man who's been pulled over for looking out of place. Every person who's been searched, humiliated, or worse, just because of the color of their skin. We're not asking for special treatment, we're demanding equal treatment." He spoke about the need for change, mandatory police training, real consequences for racial profiling, and stronger community oversight of law enforcement. He called on city leaders to take action, not just talk about it. Civil rights activists stood beside him, reinforcing his message. They laid out real policy changes they wanted to see, including better training for officers and a system for reporting and tracking racial profiling incidents. By the time the press conference ended, it was clear, this wasn't just another celebrity speaking out. This was a movement. Snoop had turned his personal injustice into a national conversation. But he wasn't just talking. He was ready to make real change. And this was only the beginning. Snoop Dogg sat on his front porch, leaning back in his chair, a blunt resting between his fingers. The cool night air felt different tonight. Lighter. Quieter. The chaos of the past few weeks had settled, but the weight of everything that happened still sat on his shoulders. He took a slow drag, watching the smoke curl into the dark sky. The past few weeks had been a whirlwind: interviews, press conferences, meetings with activists, and discussions with city officials. People had listened. Some had resisted. But change had begun. The street in front of him was peaceful, the same neighborhood where he had been pulled over not long ago. That night, he had felt humiliated, angry, and tired. But tonight, he felt something else: purpose. His phone buzzed on the armrest of his chair. He glanced at the screen. A text message. "Thank you for speaking up. Because of you, I'm not afraid to fight for what's right. Much love." Snoop exhaled slowly, a small smirk forming on his lips. He didn't know the sender, but the message said everything he needed to hear. It wasn't about him anymore. The movement was bigger than one man, one moment, or even one fight. It was about every young black kid growing up in America, every person who had ever been judged unfairly, and every voice that had been silenced for too long. He thought about all the people who had come forward, sharing their own stories of racial profiling and injustice. Some of them had never spoken about it before. But now, they were being heard. He flicked the ash off his blunt and looked up at the stars. He had spent his whole life breaking barriers, proving people wrong, and defying expectations. And yet, in that moment on the side of the road, none of it had mattered. That was the hardest truth to accept. But instead of letting it break him, he had flipped the script. He had used his voice, his influence, and his platform to make sure this wasn't just another forgotten moment. He took another slow hit, letting the smoke drift away. He had done a lot, but there was still more to do. The system wasn't going to change overnight. The fight wasn't over. Not even close. As he let out a final exhale, he muttered under his breath, a knowing smirk still on his face. "We ain't done yet." The screen on his phone dimmed, but the fire inside him burned brighter than ever.